So you're a female judge in what is a predominantly male-dominated area. How did you prepare yourself for such a role?
Well, it's true that the judiciary is still predominantly male, but of course, in the kind of judicial roles that I've sat in, so I'm a recorder in the Crown Court dealing with jury trials, and I'm a High Court deputy sitting in the Administrative Court dealing with judicial review. I'm the only judge there, so the fact that there are lots of other male judges in other courts doesn't really matter in terms of doing the job. The way I encountered it most directly was when I very first started sitting. And I went into the judges' dining room at lunchtime because they, at least in those days, did at least have communal dining for judges. And they were all men. So I walked into a dining room with sort of 12 men in it, and they all sort of swiveled their heads to look at me and thought, what's this woman, who's a solicitor apparently with primary school age children doing here? And so that was a bit uncomfortable. But actually, I've been in a male-dominated environment for a lot of my working life, because actually when you're a partner in one of the major law firms, most of your partners are male. I happen to work in the property and finance world, so most of my clients were male. So actually, I was used to it. It wasn't a particular issue that I felt I had to prepare myself for. You just get on and do the job. Actually, your gender doesn't really matter when you're doing something like that.
Do you think there are any stereotypes towards women that are judges?
Not often. Actually, on the very rare occasions I think I experienced that, it was with slightly antediluvian clients. I mean, I remember one occasion when I had a very good relationship with the finance director of a construction company, and he said he wanted to introduce me to the company chairman. So it was fine. I went along to their offices, and he'd clearly been told by this finance director that he wanted to introduce their lawyer. And he came into the reception area where I was sitting and sort of looked around and clearly thought, oh, well, the lawyer's not here yet, because it was only me sitting there. So hilariously, when the finance director came to collect me and took me to meet the chairman, his jaw dropped open because he wasn't expecting it to be me. But actually, it kind of played into my hands, because I didn't know especially what they wanted to talk about, but I had prepared an agenda of things that I wanted to talk about. So while he was sitting there with his mouth open, I was able to say, well, I'm not sure if there were things you particularly wanted to talk about, but perhaps we could talk about 1, 2, 3, and was able to take control of the meeting and, take control of the agenda. So actually it worked in my favour in the end. But that's relatively rare. There have been, I suppose there's what has been now called banter from time to time. But actually, I've just brushed it off largely. A female judge who I cited when I was talking earlier has an excellent way of dealing with that kind of thing, which is to say, that's a yellow card remark, or if it's really bad, a red card remark, which I think is brilliant, because it's light, it's humorous, but they get the message, and it's not confrontational. And I think actually being able to cope with those kind of situations does earn you respect, whereas ignoring it or just batting it away probably just means that you get it again because they're trying to provoke you, get some kind of rise or something.
So you said you had no idea you could become a judge with your experience until someone told you. Do you think these opportunities are usually presented to men rather than women?
It was wholly because I was a solicitor, not because I was a woman. I had imagined, I hadn't really thought about it, but I had imagined that this was something that advocates did, barristers did. And it's true that that has been the conventional path and is still the conventional path. So solicitors are, I think, at a disadvantage, because unless you are in the kind of practice where you are spending a lot of time in court or around court, working in that environment is not something that you'll be at all familiar with. And I found it really, really tough. It's very difficult to make the transition from an office-based, collaborative kind of environment where typically you're advising people to a very isolated environment where you're in charge and you're making decisions. So it was the transition was difficult, but since I have learned and indeed myself become a judge from an unrelated practice area, I've been evangelical about trying to encourage other solicitors to consider it as a career. And it seems to have worked, because I should think probably a dozen people already have come to talk to me at this conference. And that's really what I wanted to achieve by being here, was to make people aware. And I said to all of them, this is not something I would suggest that you do, next week, next month, even next year, but I want to plant the seeds so that you're aware of the opportunity, and you might come back to that in a year or 2 or 5, as I did. I mean, it took me 5 or 6 years probably after someone drew my attention to the opportunities to think, right, actually, maybe I'll give that a go now. So that's really what I wanted to achieve.
Why do you think there are fewer female judges in comparison to male?
Ooh, that's a big question, and a really quite difficult one. Actually, interestingly, I know from my work on the Judicial Appointments Commission that women are typically more successful when they do apply. And I think that's true of many things, that actually women are more reluctant to apply for a whole range of reasons, including perhaps not wanting to do the job, which is, perfectly acceptable. But they tend to be better prepared when they do. So the success rate of women typically outstrips the success rate of men. So it's really a question of whether women are applying in great enough numbers. And I think that's where the issue lies.
As you evolved throughout your career in Linklaters, did you see a change in diversity and inclusivity?
Yes, I think it has. I never for a moment detected any discrimination or any suggestion that female solicitors were less able than male solicitors. In fact, it was well known that female solicitors were often amongst the highest performers. But many of them made a career choice for all the sorts of reasons that we've been hearing about today, about not pursuing their career to the top. And one of the reasons I think they didn't do that was because there were relatively few role models of women partners I'm talking about. And those that there were, you could see women below thinking, I don't want to live my life like any of them. So they themselves, if you like, self-selected off the partnership track. But I think there has been a real sea change. I retired as a partner effectively 15 years ago, so my personal experience of the firm is now quite out of date. But I am amazed and impressed by the radical changes that have taken place in terms of, gender diversity, all kinds of other diversity. I mean, we had the whole building lit up in rainbow colours, for example, taking part in Gay Pride, a whole allies scheme for the our LGBT colleagues. So actually, I think there has been the most fantastic transformation in the understanding of the importance of inclusion and diversity, rightly, because, as has been said at this conference by several speakers, it's a business benefit to have people with different perspectives, different backgrounds, different views, because it's so much more creative to bring to the team people who have different ideas. I think the most important thing I've learned is to go for things. And actually several speakers have referred to this. You have to be either brave or foolhardy, or maybe a bit of both, but just to volunteer for things or to push yourself into something that you're not quite sure you tick all the boxes, but you'll give it a go. And my appointment as a recorder, for example, was a classic example of that, where I thought, well, I reckon I'm a pretty good lawyer. I reckon I could do the job. Having watched other people do it, I think I could do that. But it was only once I'd been appointed, and so many people who were appointed along with me said, gosh, you're brave. And I thought, am I? I hadn't realised I was being that brave. But actually it was, and remains to some extent, a really quite scary thing to do, because it's so far from the day job that I had actually become quite experienced in, and therefore had quite a lot of not only competence but confidence, to go right back to the bottom of something that I knew I didn't know how to do particularly well, if at all, and having to learn that right, having been a respected senior professional, to go right back to the bottom of the sort of learning curve is really quite a difficult thing to do. And to be honest, I think it requires a level of sort of humility, and indeed, I suppose courage in a way, plus hard work. I mean, I really, really had to learn how to do it in a way that I think, I wouldn't say that senior people don't learn and don't work hard, but when you realise that you're up against people who know far more than you, are much more experienced than you, that's quite a daunting experience when you've reached a senior position in another field yourself. But the upside is that I feel it's been incredibly worthwhile. I mean, I found it immensely rewarding. And at a personal level, it's very satisfying to have overcome challenges, to be able to do something that is really, really difficult. And I say to people, look, why do people climb mountains? They do it because it's really difficult. And when you get to the top, you feel really pleased with yourself. Yeah. And that's kind of what it's been about for me. I wouldn't suggest for a moment I'm at the top of the judiciary. Obviously, I'm not, and I don't aspire to be. But having overcome those initial difficulties, to be able to do it and to encourage others to do the same, for which I've also, I'm pleased to say, been relatively successful, is very, very satisfying.
In order to achieve true equality in the workplace, how important is it for men and women to work symbiotically?
I actually think it's incredibly important that this is seen to be about people rather than women, or indeed men as well. That it's actually about people's working lives and getting the best out of people, including the career progression that means that after all that training, after all that hard work, that you don't waste all that talent, because it has been heartbreaking for me over the years to see some really excellent women, and indeed men, leave because they just can't really make it work for lifestyle reasons. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done to restructure the workplace, which is, it's a big ask, because let's face it, it's been a very, very successful model. So I think that it requires a really huge effort of will and imagination to see that it could be even better, because you would get not only the diversity and inclusion that we've been talking about, but the creativity, the innovation, the, I think, appeal not only to the best lawyers and the best others who can support them, but actually it would serve the clients better as well. I'm not seeing this is likely to happen overnight. It's obviously work in progress, but I know that some other professional services firms are being very creative about the way that they're addressing attrition of all sorts by making the workplace. No one would design the workplace, I think, the way it is now for the kind of people who are entering it. But to change it, of course, takes an awful lot of effort. And there have been, I know, some amazing efforts in some other organisations to enable people to take more leave, paid or unpaid, etc., so that they can buy extra leave, for example, so that it accommodates their lives with their children, their school holidays, caring for elderly parents, whatever it may be. It doesn't mean that they still can't do the work. It requires effort on all sides, but I think it will come.